When you think of the 1980s, what comes to mind? Neon lights, big hair, and rebellious muscle cars that shouted freedom at every turn. But not all 80s cars were the definition of cool. Some of them were downright ugly. Yet, somehow, they still shaped the car world in their own unique way. Today, we're diving into the top 10 most unattractive cars of the 80s. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single one of these eye-catching disasters. Chrysler Laser, 1984. Kicking off our list at number 1. We have the Chrysler Laser, a car that tried to blend sportiness with elegance, but failed miserably. Its boxy, awkward design made it look like a science experiment gone wrong, and its performance couldn't save it from ridicule. The Laser was meant to capture that 1980s flair for futuristic design, but instead, it looked more like a reject from a failed science fiction show. Still, this car represents that moment in time when car manufacturers tried to push the envelope, sometimes too far. Number 2. Chevrolet Cavalier, 1982. From one weird experiment to another, we move on to the Chevrolet Cavalier. When you think of an 80s car, the Cavalier doesn't exactly scream muscle car, does it? Instead, it just screams, what was that? With its bulging body and disproportionate features, the Cavalier was about as far from a classic muscle car as you could get. Yet, it had a significant role in shaping the compact car market. And somehow, people still bought it a true lesson in how function sometimes trumps form. Number 3. Ford EXP, 1982. Next up, the Ford EXP. A small car with big dreams, but zero execution. A mix of sportiness and economy. It became one of the most criticized cars of the 1980s. Its odd proportions and unimpressive performance made it a symbol of how manufacturers tried to combine fun with practicality, and failed spectacularly. The EXP's awkward styling was only outdone by its weak engine options, leaving us wondering what Ford was thinking when they released this car. Number 4. Pontiac Fiero, 1984. Now, we're diving into the infamous Pontiac Fiero, a car that stirred up controversy. It promised sports car vibes with a mid-engine design, but delivered a styling nightmare. The Fiero looked like it was trying to be something it wasn't, blending sleek lines with an industrial look that was way ahead of its time, but not in a good way. It was also plagued with performance issues that made it hard to enjoy. And soon, this car became the joke of the 1980s. Yet, it was loved by some for its boldness. Number 5. Buick Skyhawk, 1982. Here we have the Buick Skyhawk, a car that tried too hard to look sporty, but fell flat on its face. It didn't know whether it wanted to be a performance car or an economy car, and as a result, it did neither. The Skyhawk's boxy design wasn't exactly cutting edge, and while it did have some decent engine options, its looks simply didn't match the potential. It's one of those cars that could have been great if Buick had figured out the right mix. But unfortunately, it just became a symbol of mid-80s confusion. Number 6. Ford Mustang, 1980 to 1982. The Mustang. The 80s brought us the Fox body Mustang, and although it's now beloved by some enthusiasts, in its day, it was considered a massive downgrade from the classic Mustangs of the 60s. With its bulbous front end, plain interior, and a strange attempt at modernizing the Mustang's iconic look, it left many muscle car fans disappointed. The Mustang, known for its freedom and rebellion, lost some of its edge in this design, making it more of a forgettable 80s oddity. Number 7. Chevrolet Chevette, 1981. Now, we move on to the Chevrolet Chevette, a car that looks like it came from a different era. Its simplistic, almost boxy design didn't scream muscle car, or even modern. It was a cheap, economy-minded vehicle that offered little excitement, and its unappealing exterior just added to the lackluster feel. The Chevette tried to do what the Cavalier failed at, be a practical car for the masses, but it had little to offer in terms of excitement or style. Number 8. AMC Eagle, 1980. The AMC Eagle is next, and let me tell you, this car was an enigma. Part station wagon, part off-road vehicle, and entirely weird in its execution. The Eagle's mismatched design felt out of place on the road, and it couldn't decide if it was a rugged vehicle or an urban cruiser. While it did have its fans, many dismissed it as one of the ugliest crossovers in car history. It wasn't just about style. It was a vehicle that didn't know what it wanted to be, and it showed. Number 9. Dodge Omni GLH, 1984. The Dodge Omni GLH, often considered one of the ugliest cars of the 1980s. This hatchback was meant to deliver performance, but it failed to impress in the looks department. With its odd, clunky design and boxy body, it wasn't going to win any beauty contests. But, oddly enough, it's one of the few cars that brought a little performance excitement to the table, in a time when muscle cars were starting to fade away. It was a strange mix of ugly but functional. Number 10. Chevrolet Camaro, 1982. And finally, we come to the Chevrolet Camaro of the early 80s, a car that promised to carry on the legacy of the muscle car era, but ended up being one of the least inspiring designs ever seen in the Camaro's history. This version was boxy, awkward, and lacked the powerful muscle car look that made the Camaro an icon in the past. The once proud Camaro had become a shadow of its former self, and by the time the 1980s were over, it had lost its identity altogether. So, there you have it. The 10 most unattractive cars of the 1980s. Some were bold, some were just bad, and others were a weird mix of both. While they may have been eyesores, each of these cars played a role in shaping the future of the automotive world, for better or for worse. But hey, the 80s weren't all bad for cars in the next video. We'll dive into some epic muscle car modifications that brought these iconic machines back to life. You won't want to miss it, so be sure to hit that subscribe button, like, and leave a comment if you agree with our list. Catch you in the next video, car lovers.